Welcome to Back to the Bible with pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark. All this month, Bryan will be focusing on the birth of Christ. We trust this will deepen your relationship with God as you prepare your heart for the true meaning of Christmas. Now let's join Bryan for today's inspiring message.
There's a popular country western song right now where the singer is seeking to convince you that he's a man of conviction. And at one point in the song, he says that he believes in Jesus, and he believes that Jesus sees us, and if you ask him, he would say that he's a man of conviction. Well, that's a pretty strong statement. What's interesting is 10 minutes later, you can hear that exact same artist singing a song, wondering if he still has enough energy to sleep with two women at one time. And he seems to see no conflict between one song and the other. But that's fairly typical in that country world. There's a lot of cultural Christianity. Sometimes those country songs are so theologically correct, we could sing them here. And at other times you wonder, do they stay up all night trying to figure out new ways to offend God? And often it's the same artist, different song. But that isn't just true of country music. It's true of all of our music. It's true of our culture in general. We have what we might call a cultural Christianity with all sorts of inconsistencies that really define us as a nation. Over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on the 10 Commandments and having them in our parks and in government buildings and schools, and a lot of energy put into that. But a recent survey showed the overwhelming majority of people that are zealous for that can't even name the 10 Commandments. And I'm guessing probably don't give a lot of thought on a daily basis to the implications of the 10 Commandments to the daily choices we make. There's kind of a cultural Christianity to that, but you still find yourself wondering or asking the question, do they really get it? But there's probably no time when that is more evident than the Christmas season, when millions and millions and millions of people will celebrate Christmas. One of the things that strikes me every year at Christmas is how theologically rich the traditional Christmas carols are. They are some of the most theologically rich and accurate songs we have. The entire message of the gospel, it's all there. And you listen, they play it on TV commercials. They play it on a variety of television shows. It plays over the radio from a variety of artists. It plays in the malls, it plays in the stores, it plays everywhere. And you find yourself asking the question, does anybody really understand what's being said? As a matter of fact, we know that if a politician were to say the exact same things that are sung all over our nation at Christmastime, he would be massacred in the media. But for some reason, it's okay if it's in a warm, fuzzy Christmas tune. And again, you find yourself asking the question, are we listening to what we're saying? There's a cultural Christianity that embraces Christmas, it embraces Easter, but I'm not convinced really understands the message. This is the fourth week of Advent. In my opinion, it is the theme of this fourth week that separates out the cultural Christians from those who truly understand what it means to follow Jesus. Theme number one, the first week was Jesus as the light, and people are fine with that. The second week is Jesus as the Savior. Many people don't really understand the implications of that, but it seems to cause no real reaction. Third week is Jesus as God, and people seem to kind of affirm that. They give some sort of intellectual assent to that anyway. But the fourth week, this week, is Jesus as the King. And this is where the conflict arises over the question, who will sit on the throne of your life. It's very easy to affirm all the warm fuzzies of Christmas. And as long as God's there to do what we need him to do, we're good with that. But when Jesus comes along and says, but by the way, I want to be king. I want it to be my purpose, my mission, my agenda, and I want you to surrender your life to me. That's when the cost gets too high. And we often separate out the cultural Christians from those who truly understand what it means to follow Jesus. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Matthew chapter 2. The problem 2,000 years ago, the tension point, is still the same problem today, 2,000 years later. And it has to do with this idea of Jesus being the king. We often sing the famous Christmas carol, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." It's a lovely tune, but the problem is they weren't kings. There probably were more than three, and they weren't from the Orient. Other than that, it's got it right. Matthew chapter 2 records the historical details. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Now, let's take just a minute to talk about the places and the people to set this story. After Jesus was born, oftentimes you'll see a nativity scene that has the wise men there at the manger, but of course that's not accurate. They came some months afterward. There is a different Greek word for infant and for child, and this uses the word child, but that child could be 2 months old, and the Greek word would apply. So we don't know how much time has passed, probably several months. They don't come to the stable, they come to a house in Bethlehem.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our program.
Bethlehem was just a sleepy little town of about 2,000 people, about 6 miles from Jerusalem. But certainly not an insignificant town in the history of the Hebrew people. It's the approximate place where Jacob buried his wife Rachel. It's the place where Ruth met Boaz, and it's the hometown of David, their greatest king. So a lot of history came out of Bethlehem. In the days of Herod the king. Now, it gets a little bit confusing. Herod wasn't really his name. Herod was a title. So in the lifetime of Jesus, there are actually 3 different Herods. There's this Herod, there's the Herod that's eaten by worms, and there's the Herod that's present in the Easter story. And those are 3 different Herods, a grandfather, a son, and a grandson. This particular Herod is the one that was dubbed by the Caesar Herod the Great. Because in many ways, he was a very effective leader, he was a very good politician, and he did what the Roman Caesars wanted him to do, and they dubbed him Herod the Great. He was born in 73 BC, he was made king in 40 BC. By 37 BC, he had wiped out all of the opposition. In 20 BC, he built the famous temple. That's the temple that's present through the story of Jesus, and he died in 4 BC. Now, if you're tracking with me, you say, how could he have died in 4 BC and then Jesus isn't born for 4 more years? How could he be this Herod? Well, we have a bit of a dating problem. The reality is Jesus was born probably 5 or 6 BC. So ironically enough, Jesus was born 5 or 6 years before himself. During the time of the Romans, they factored time from the founding of the city. So by this time period, it was 760 some years since the founding of the city. But in the 6th century, Dionysius decided to transfer over the Roman way of tracking time to what we're familiar with today, the BC AD way of recording time. BC, of course, is before Christ, and AD is not after death. You have a little time gap there if you do that. It's Anno Domini, which basically Anno is Latin for year, and Domini is Latin for Lord, in the year of our Lord. And basically it's before Jesus and after the birth of Jesus. The problem is that when Dionysius was factoring this, somewhere he got off in his factoring. He got off by 5 or 6 years. So strangely enough, Jesus was actually born 5 or 6 years before himself, and Herod died in 4 BC. So that's the reason for the strange dating there. As far as Herod himself, even though in some ways he was a very effective king, in other ways he was a very brutal, bloodthirsty king. One interesting dynamic about Herod is that he didn't actually flow out of the bloodline of one who should be king. He didn't come out of Jacob, he came out of Esau. So he lived in constant fear that someone who had the legal right to the throne would emerge and he would be dethroned. So because of that, it led to some very strong paranoia. He married 10 different women. He had one wife who was his favorite, and he killed her. Then he killed her mother. Then he killed her grandmother. He killed his brother-in-law. He murdered 3 of his own sons, which is what prompted the Caesar to say it would be better to be Herod's sow than his son, which is a kind of a famous saying that comes out of the ancient world. Herod, in the last months of his life, became so deranged that on his deathbed, he was fearful that when he died, the kingdom would not mourn his death. And he was probably right about that. So in order to address that, he gathered thousands upon thousands of leaders from all parts of the kingdom, assembled them all together in the Hippodrome in Jericho with the orders that at the moment of his death, his soldiers were supposed to massacre these leaders by the thousands, which would cause a wave of sorrow to go across the kingdom, and history would record that at the moment of his death, sorrow spread throughout the kingdom. Thankfully, at the moment of his death, the soldiers opened the doors and the leaders were released, and there was no such bloodbath. But that gives you a little bit of insight as to the type of person he was, especially during this time of the story. In the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Magi is in some ways short for magician, probably astronomers. From the east, probably Persia or Babylon. One of the interesting things to consider is if he was from Babylon, if the Magi were from Babylon, and that is likely in my opinion, you go back to Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 5, and you find that when Daniel was in Babylon, he was put over the Magi, the astronomers, and the magicians. It is very likely that Daniel then taught them this deep, rich theology that they passed on to their descendants, and very likely these Magi, their ancestors, had been taught by Daniel himself, and that's how they knew about this, and that's what caused them to follow the star. Now that may or may not be the case, but certainly interesting to think about. Probably not 3. 3 is determined by the number of gifts, but probably an entourage that came with them. In the 6th century, they were given names, they were given some sort of racial background. All of that stuff is just contrived. It's all made up. We really don't know any of that. They came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, one of the things that's interesting here is we refer to these men as wise men. But you have to question their wisdom of standing before a deranged king and in essence saying, you're an imposter. We're here to see he who was born King of the Jews. Do you know where he is? It's probably fortunate that Herod didn't just kill them at that moment. But the reality, he was a very shrewd politician. He understood, I need them in order to find out where this king is, in order to eliminate the competition. But in essence, that is what the Magi said. We're here to worship the real king. Do you happen to know where he is? When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod was troubled for obvious reasons. I think Jerusalem was troubled because of the potential of this precipitating a bloodbath, which wouldn't have been unusual for Herod. But it is interesting to think about. Apparently, all Israel, it's a way of saying word spread throughout the city that according to the Magi, their Messiah had been born. And now they're going to find out where, and of course they identify Bethlehem.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our program.
Now, wouldn't you think if these people have been waiting for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for the Messiah, that the religious leaders and the people of Jerusalem would have taken this short 2-hour trip to Bethlehem in order to investigate? But as far as we know from history, not one single person of the religious leaders and of this crowd made that very short trip in order to determine if this was true or not. I think it's just a snapshot of where these people were during the birth of Jesus in terms of their faith journey. Even though they would have given intellectual assent to the belief that someday a Messiah will come, the fact is that the religious leaders had their religious machine in place. They had developed this level of self-righteousness. They were wielding the power, and they really weren't interested in investigating whether or not this was true. I think, frankly, the people were at a point where deep in their hearts, they did not believe it would ever happen. Gathering together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." He goes to the religious leaders, asks them, where is the Messiah to be born? He has already connected. This king must be their Messiah. And they identify from the prophet Micah that it's supposed to be in Bethlehem. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." Obviously, Herod's trying to figure out when the star appeared to approximate the age of the child. He's trying to get necessary details to formulate his plan. He says he wants to worship the child, but of course we know he wants to eliminate the competition. I think without question what Matthew's doing in this text is setting up a contrast between the response of the religious leaders and Herod with the response of the Magi, because it in essence is a foreshadowing of what we're going to get in the rest of the gospel. In the rest of the gospel, as Jesus manifests himself, you're going to have two groups. You're going to have those that want to eliminate the competition, and you have those that will bow and worship the king. And so I think that's what he's setting up here right from the beginning. After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Now let's talk about this star for a moment. For some reason, there's a lot of people, even within Christian circles, that feel the overwhelming need to be able to explain this star. That it's somehow something having to do with the planets, and a certain thing was happening in the sky, and that ultimately formulated the star, and that all makes the story plausible. Why is it so hard to imagine that this was just a miraculous star for this purpose? Think about it this way. We just came out of Matthew chapter 1. We just came out of a story where Mary got up one morning and she was pregnant, having never had relations with a man. She is also pregnant with the God of the universe who is now becoming flesh. If we come out of chapter 1 and believe that, then a star is really no problem. So why is it so hard to believe that God just made a star for this purpose? But even practically speaking, think of it this way. Let's imagine that tonight the moon is out and the moon is full. You look at that moon and you answer me. Is that moon over Lincoln or Omaha or Waverly or Grand Island or Firth or Hickman? How can you tell? Looks like it's over all of them. Even if we together conclude the moon is over Lincoln, fine, over your house or my house. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no way that you could tell. It had to be a miraculous star that led them to the exact house. That's the way the text reads. If chapter 1 is true, then the star is really no problem. All right. Feel better, don't you? I do. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Look at the redundancy of verse 10. Again, I think Matthew's purpose is to contrast the response of the Magi with the response of Herod and the religious leaders. There's a great deal of redundancy as a way of saying they were very, very joyful to find this baby king. After coming to the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Notice when the Magi come in, they fell to the ground and worshiped him. That Greek word translated fell to the ground is a word that means they basically got prostrate on their face before the baby.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. Visit today, backtothebible.org.